What are the most pertinent things that I need to know about your earliest years to understand you?
Oh my goodness. I spend 2 hours answering that question on its own. I don't know how interesting it would be. I'll try and give you a brief answer.
I like the long answers.
Or do you?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, my parents are, my mum's British, my dad's American. They are both, in different respects, sort of free thinkers. They grew up in the 60s and they embraced aspects of the counterculture. They regarded their own parents as being, in certain respects, sort of limited and cloistered. And so my mum joined VSO, Volunteer Service Overseas, to get experience of life in Africa. My dad joined the Peace Corps. He would have been probably enlisted to serve in Vietnam, and he didn't want to do that. So he went to teach in Africa as well, and that's where they met. So I was raised, I was born in Singapore, where they were teaching. My brother was born in Uganda, where they were teaching at that time, my older brother. But then they settled in London. And so growing up, I was conscious of them as people who really encouraged us to open our minds. And maybe, it was sort of 99% positive, like 1%, I think, like a lot of people, people use this term social justice warriors, right? As a form of judgment about overly do-gooding. Like there's an element of, I don't tend to use that term because it's been weaponized. But I suppose in a sense, my parents were kind of social justice warriors. Like they were very much encouraging me to challenge, or us to challenge racism where we saw it, to challenge sexism, to be open to new experiences, not to fall into easy judgments about other cultures and other countries and other people. And I only say the 1%. Sometimes that can be inflected with a little bit of a sense of superiority, and I talk a bit about that in my book, a slight feeling that we weren't really quite like other people. Other people were maybe not quite as smart or not quite as literary, and I don't, I strive not to endorse, or whatever is in me remains in me of that, I try to unpack and eradicate. But nevertheless, that's the way, looking back on it, that's something that I see and pick up on. My dad's a writer, a novelist. My mum is after teaching, my dad became a very successful literary novelist and travel writer. My mum went on to become a radio producer and worked for the BBC World Service, which is, for those who don't know, that's the service that broadcasts all over the world. And it's a bit like Radio 4, but broadcast, this tiny language. It's an extraordinary institution. It sort of represents in some ways the best of the BBC. But so I was growing up sort of aware that we were a family that loved books and loved reading. And we watched TV and listened to pop music and did the normal things. But I think underneath it all was a feeling that to really count in life, you should be a literary writer. Like that was, without me fully maybe acknowledging it, that was underneath this thing that you should really, I think still my dad probably feels that. Like he's very supportive of me and my TV making, but he's like, Lou, have you thought about writing another book? Lou, you've got time, you've got the talent, you can, I don't want to push you into this, but Lou, you should think about writing a book. That's a great idea for a book, that kind of thing. Anyway, so that all of that was underlying my attitude to life. Then they sent me off to school, primary school. You wanted a long answer. This is maybe more than you bargained for. I suppose alongside that is the influence of friends, and I can start. So the countervailing impulses of growing up in the 70s and 80s in South London and being exposed to funny, creative people, and my friendship group, who some of them have gone on to work in sort of civilian, quote unquote, lives as, restaurateurs or music, other stuff. But saliently were Adam Buxton, Joe Cornish, and another friend, Zach Sandler, who were super creative. Adam and Joe went on to have their own TV show, and I was conscious of falling in with a little group, Amelia, of like-minded kids who were very funny, really into movies, TV, and that was where I suppose I began to feel that there was, I don't want to, in hindsight, it's tempting to sort of read back what I do now into that, but I just know that friendship group was very important to me and maybe counteracted some of the more, because I was academic. I did really well at school. I feel like I could just go on and on. Should I keep going?
I just listen here.
Because the other part of it was that I was quite an anxious child, so I worried about everything, and I would think about things that were on the horizon. Like when I was 5 or 6 years old, I remember fixating. There were various things that came and went that really worried me, but one was the idea of maypole dancing, which was a big. I don't know if it's still like in state primaries at that time. Every May holiday, like you would do maypole dancing.
What is that? Sorry.
It's an old English or maybe British tradition where there's a big pole. I think it's like a fertility rite. It's a touch of Wicker Man about it. It's an enormous kind of mast, a pole, like maybe like a totem pole, almost like sort of 20 feet high. And then there's ribbons around it. And as children, you would skip round it and you would sort of braid the ribbons together to form nice patterns. And I remember seeing them doing it in primary school and thinking like, that looks really hard. And I'm going to have to do that next year. And I don't know how I'm going to do it. And I remember being preoccupied with how am I going to learn how to do that? I only mention that as an example. Like there were other things like just reading. Before I could read, I remember seeing my older brother reading and thinking, like, I don't know how you do that. And just getting very worried about it. So in general, I'm someone who is, I know everyone worries, but I just feel as though that feeling of worry and anxiety was quite a strong background note. And sometimes I would control my anxiety, not consciously, but again, looking back, by working hard, like by sort of becoming almost like super focused on academic work. And as a result, I did very well in school. And, like those people who look back and say like, well, I was a fuck up in school. I was the opposite. Like I didn't always, I would get in trouble. Like, and sometimes I was regarded as, especially when I was younger, 12, 13, as a disruptive element because I was also quite cheeky and sometimes tried to communicate and connect with people via teasing, right? Which is, I don't know if that's it's quite a British thing in a way. It's certainly a big thing in my family was what's now called bants, right? And sometimes I'd try and do bants with my teacher and then it wouldn't go well. And so, but in general, which is confusing, like being regarded as a black sheep in class or a disruptive person in class, and then, but then also getting in trouble. They said like, it's fine for you to mess about and get in trouble, and then you do the homework and you're fine, but you're a bad influence on the other kids. I used to get told that. You're a bad influence on I was like, that's not true at all. Like if anything, my friends were just as naughty and were leading me astray, but nevertheless, because I could sort of go home and then become sort of organized and focus on my work, I got for a brief period, I got labeled as the troublemaker. Anyway, going through school, I sort of, the lodestars for my sort of sense of who I was and how I would progress in life, such as it is. I mean, I was never that tactical, but as I went through school, I thought, well, I'm pretty good academically. I guess I'll just do well in exams and stuff and then see what happens. And meanwhile, with my friends, we'd be seeing movies. I got into rap music in the late 80s and so would dress like a sort of hip hop nerd. I was smoking quite a lot of weed, but still studying. This was sort of, again, age 16, 17, but it never really interfered with my work. I went on to Oxford, and then having done well at Oxford, left university, and at that point it was like, well, what happens now? That was when it felt like, okay, now I've no longer really got a clear path. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think if you're academic, if you find academic work not easy, but you find that you do well at it, because it's not easy, but you apply yourself and you do well at it, then sometimes life can be a weird bump in the road, like real life. It's something like, well, where are the exams? Because I know I can do those. What do I do now? So for a while I thought maybe I would be like a professor or an academic or something, but then something in me told me that wasn't quite right. So then the rest of life is another story, but I hope that sort of answers your questions about those different sort of sources of how I sort of, my whatever it is, personality and interests.
One of the things that really stood out to me in that answer was your early relationship with work. You said you used to work hard to kind of suppress or kind of distract yourself from the anxiety of life. Is that accurate?
Well, what it is, I worried about things in general. And, one of those worries was homework or doing well in school. Like, another worry was getting on with my peer group. But insofar as I could control those sources of anxiety, like, work is actually relatively straightforward. Like, in terms of like, how do I get more, how do I attempt to relate to people better? Well, that's kind of hard. It's like mysterious, but how do I do well at these assignments I'm being given? Then you just sit down and do them until you get it right. And a lot of these things are subconscious. Like, I'm not thinking like, oh, how can I control my anxiety? But I would just find that if exams were coming up, I'd get super anxious. And I don't mean to pathologize it. Like, I've never been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. I'm just slightly worry prone. And as it happens, I've become less worry prone as I've grown up. And it may be that there were other things going on, in my family life. Who knows? My parents' marriage wasn't always happy. They subsequently divorced. There were other things that probably were going on that were stressful. But for whatever reason, I found that almost without meaning to, I took my studies very seriously. I have to sort of slightly check myself when I say this, because I'm also aware that I've looked back at some of my reports, having kind of got quite attached to this narrative of myself as sort of super swot, right, super studious. And I've looked at some of my old report cards, and some of them are especially when I'm 6 or 7, sort of say, Louis is a pleasure to have in class, but sometimes it would be nice if you would let other pupils speak. He enjoys the sound of his own voice, kind of thing, which is very apropos for this podcast, probably. And like so I had a sort of rambunctious side, and almost in social settings. My mum tells a story, it's actually in my book, but of how when I was about 5 or 6, I would come home and I'd be really sad. I'd be like, I don't know, I don't like school anymore. And she'd sort of think, well, Louis is obviously not getting on well at school. I need to talk to his teacher. And she went into class and talked to the teachers and said, do you understand Louis is very sensitive? He's a very sensitive young man. As I say, I would have been maybe 5 or 6, 7 years old. And the teachers were like, really? Yes, he's a very sensitive, like, you just be mindful that, things you can say might hurt his feelings, something like that. And they were like struggling to recognize her description of me. And then on the way out of class, she passed the classroom and could see through one of the glass windows in the door. And I was running along the desktops or doing a dance on top of a desk. In other words, like, it was almost like in the setting itself, I was a wild child and just running amok. But also, I had like this doubling. Like, and then I go home and be worrying about small, which I think is probably still true of me in some ways. That I have that sort of disruptive trickster impulse alongside a certain sensitivity.
Is that a defense mechanism or a way to, I don't know, survive in a social setting? Or is that the true nature of who you are?
I think it's who I am. And I think, I could say, oh, well, I was a younger child and my parents found me funny and I wanted to perform and I wanted my dad to, I wanted to get the approval of my parents by being silly. But the fact is who knows? Like, I just know that, things like your sense of humor or your inclination to be cheeky, that's just always been in me, I'm slightly wary of attempting to sort of unpick where that comes from, because I just know that's always been in me.
The relationship with work, I think even for myself, I learned my relationship with work at a very young age. And I think I developed quite an unhealthy relationship with work at the expense of other things that matter in life.
Yeah, me too. I think I can relate to that.
And that's what I was trying to understand is like, where did your relationship with work come from? On one hand, I was guessing maybe it's from his father, who was very, insistent on in being an intellectual is success, Louis. Or is it from the distraction from anxiety and from the social thing where you could be successful at exams because you were good at that, so you double down?
I think it was all of the above. Like, both my parents have work ethics that border on this sort of being over the top. My dad would, he's a, as I said, he's a writer, and at the weekends, like he didn't really take weekends off. Like certainly Saturdays he would often be writing, and Sunday mornings he was often writing, and he's an extraordinary. I wanted to give both my parents a shout out. See, my parents were basically first generation university educated, came from very much not at the high table of life, and so for my dad to sort of become a wealthy literary writer is kind of an amazing thing that he did. In the world of, it's one thing to be a popular novelist. That's hard anyway. To be a novelist or travel writer who's extremely successful, had sold hundreds of thousands or millions of books, just without any leg up in life, is an amazing thing. And I wonder if I've ever told him that. I hope I have. Anyway, he'll listen to this probably because he follows my career with interest. So some of that I would have taken on board just through osmosis of seeing that. Likewise, my mum being super studious, going to Oxford. She grew up in Tooting, and her sense of sort of self-belief, or her sense of her own destiny, whatever it was, and in her small, peer group of kids who were educated at a state school, and then through her own hard work and the support of her teachers going to Oxford, in the 60s as a woman, that was extremely unusual. So that was in the air. But in the end, and my older brother, who was very studious. And the other thing just to reflect on is that I saw my brother as the more brilliant child. Like he was, the way I saw it at the time was more effortlessly brilliant, like sort of child prodigy material, And I thought I was just kind of a sort of irrelevant bit of afterbirth that, trailed around after him. And so when I noticed that I was getting fairly good results when I was sort of 11, 12, it didn't feel particularly impressive. Like it felt like, well, I guess I can do well if I work hard. It's not like I'm kind of brilliant like my older brother. But I think when I, again, in hindsight, I think mainly what I see is a sense that I just felt like this was something I had to do. It wasn't a choice. And I even later on when I was at university, I sometimes used to worry that I wonder if I'm missing out. People say it's the best years of your life and you should be just going wild, having fun. And I did some of that, but I was also conscious of like maybe I'm missing out by studying too hard.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.